Okay, please consider this an introduction to a topic, kind of like a little bit of an awareness talk. This is something that has only begun to be written about in the EM literature in the United States within the past year, 2017, 2018. Our Canadian and European EM brothers and sisters have a little bit of a leg up on us. They started writing about it in their literature a few years ago. And then first responders as well as social workers and clinical therapists have been writing about it for longer than this. So this is a little awareness talk. And just to define our terms, the word trauma comes from a Greek word trauma, meaning wound. So I think at this point in our journey, we mainly consider wound a bodily wound. When we think of level 1 trauma code, level 2 trauma code, level 3 trauma code, call it trauma consult, things like this, we're talking about wounds of the body. They're the wounds that you can see with your physical eye, as well as the internal bodily wounds that we use things like the ultrasound for, that's why we have an EFAC, right? That's why we use further imaging, or sometimes in the most serious cases to detect internal bodily injury, why they go immediately to why a patient goes immediately to the OR. There's also a wound of the mental, emotional, soulful. So these are also wounds. The point here being that traumatic events leave an impression. That impression becomes embedded, and that embedding is also trauma. So what I'm after here is kind of like an EFAST of the soul. So our job daily involves actual or threatened death, serious injury, violence, sexual violence, failed resuscitations, child abuse, loneliness, and the list goes on. This is part and parcel of our job. It's the job that we signed up to do. I think most of us in this room feel grateful to do it and would choose to continue to do it. So we're highly susceptible to secondary trauma, which is the wound incurred with exposure to the person experiencing the trauma or details of the traumatic event. The point being that we don't train for secondary trauma. We don't train for it, and we don't talk about it. Versus, for example, clinical psychotherapists are trained from day one. Day one of their training has within it the idea that it's to be expected that they will suffer trauma, hearing about traumas on a daily basis. So it's built into their training, built into their curriculum. But secondary trauma threatens us and our career longevity, our sense of fulfillment in our work. And it's thought to be, in this recent writing that I'm talking about, it's thought to be potentially the root cause of burnout. Like we hear a lot about burnout. The idea being that if we could pull back the layers of burnout and get to its sort of deep-seated cause, that cause may be the secondary trauma that we're experiencing. But these wounds as of yet are unexplored and they're untalked about. So PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. Secondary trauma is sometimes used like synonymously with PTSD. We fall as clinical providers and caregivers, we fall under this quote unquote A4. So just to quote a little bit from the DSM, I just feel I was going to say, I think the DSM is kind of silly, which is a small talk for another time, or a long talk for another time, but it's what we have to work with now, so I am quoting from the DSM. So PTSD in general is exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in the following ways. The idea being that the first, like the A1 would be the person experiencing the event, 2 is someone directly witnessing the event, 3 is a close family member or friend, and 4, we fall as clinical providers and caretakers under A4, which is experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of traumatic events. I also just wanted to mention in this definition, the exposure to actual or threatened death. I just wanted to heighten this idea of threatened death because I think as we're trained in our job, as we very well should be, it's part of our job to consider every time we see a patient, what's the worst that could be happening? What could they possibly be dying of? All the way from fast track through to CCT and everyone in between. That's our job, to consider that. And so that approach, which is correct in our environment, also has a lasting effect on us. This idea of a constant consideration of threatened death, what could they be dying of? So the symptoms of PTSD are many, numerable. Each one can really be talked about for a long period of time. So I'll just briefly mention some of these. Intrusion, which would involve memories, nightmares, distress. Importantly, under intrusion also comes a heightened marked physiologic reactivity, like a tachycardia, a diaphoresis, a tremulousness, some of the symptoms that we get when we think on a traumatic event. Avoidance would involve really just that it's difficult for us to think about why linger, why labor, it's over, why continue to think about it, why continue to explore it. This is where we might drink a little too much, maybe sleep with the wrong people, stuff like that. The third, I have classified as distortion. It's called different things, negative alterations in cognitions and mood. It's also called, like, this is the isolation, diminished interest kind of component of PTSD. A growing belief that I'm no good, the work is no good, the patient is no good, my attending sucks, I hate going to work, like this. An increased inability to experience positive emotions. A lot of fear, horror, anger, guilt, shame involved. Importantly here is also the feeling of alienation, that I'm the only one who's feeling this way, a kind of isolation and estrangement. And hyperarousal, which is probably a little bit self-explanatory. Irritable, self-destructive, sleep disturbance, the startle responses increase. So in my own words, haunted. I think that we all have ghosts. I think that's part of the human condition, that we all have them. I think that we, working in emergency medicine, probably have more than the usual person. I think that when you have ghosts with symptoms, like the mental, emotional, physiologic symptoms that we're talking about, I think that when you have ghosts with symptoms, you're haunted. And I think this would be my own words in how to describe a secondary trauma. It's thought to claim 15 to 20% of us as emergency providers, which is more than double in the general population. That is very, very, very difficult to tell. Why is it difficult to tell? It's difficult to tell because there's a humongous stigma still about talking about it. If I talk about it, I'm not strong, I'm not tough, people will think I won't be able to do my job, I'm not smart, things like this. The stigmatization is really not written about as yet necessarily in emergency medicine folks, as much as it's written extensively about in first responders, paramedics, that idea that there's two things that make it difficult to tell how many of us suffer this. One is that it's underreported, and two is that when it is reported, it's not taken seriously. So these kind of work in a cyclic fashion, right? It's underreported. When it is reported, it's not taken seriously, so it's underreported, like this, continuously go. Also, just specifically to residency, there's really no time to process in residency. When you're talking about being in the midst of serial 12s, there's no time to process. And it's a question if there's time to become self-aware, because half of the battle with this is to become aware that something is going on underneath the surface, that there's a wound that we cannot see. And so we sort of need a third eye, right, that we don't have yet, that hasn't been established within our training yet, like someone, not one of our colleagues or coworkers, but someone outside of the situation who can help guide us through that. And so this leaves the question of debridement. A wound has to heal. And so the first step to that process is becoming aware of the wound, that there is one. As of yet, we don't know what this will look like yet, right? With more awareness of secondary trauma will hopefully come methods built into the curricula through which debridement is possible. And we'll start to understand what that looks like, what that entails, what's required, what's needed to help us heal. And then, just before I close, I just wanted to quote from an article that was written in 2018 regarding a trauma surgeon who actually, I worked with him. He was a trauma surgeon at the medical school that I attended. In January of 2016, he voluntarily committed himself to a psychiatric hospital for a lot of these reasons. He is now back and working again. And this quote is from an article about him that was just written in 2018. In the exuberance to train medical scientists, curricula has lost sight of one fundamental fact. The human condition is incurable. And so at the deepest level, in the deepest regard, we are our patients, and we suffer what they suffer in a different way than they're suffering it, but nonetheless, it affects us. We're there. We have our hands on them, we have our hands in them, and we're there, we experience along with them. But we don't train for this, right? We have words like resiliency and wellness, but if there's no recognition of a wound, there's nothing to be resilient from. So, take-home points, I think first and foremost, I did put this together and put these take-home points. These are indeed the take-home points. I also just want, the biggest take-home point I really wanted to give is that you are amazing. It's really the truth. I think that we do a beautiful and difficult job. And like I said, I think all of us would choose to do it again. And I think that the more that we can sort of talk in an honest way, the more that that strengthens each of us working alongside of each other. So we occur trauma which we cannot see. Due to the nature of our job, we are particularly susceptible, and these wounds require attention and understanding and improvement. And that's it. That's my artwork. Those are references. Thank you. Yeah.
That was wonderful. Yeah, that was very wonderful. So actually, we have a new chief patient safety operating officer who's an emergency physician who was just hired in LA County. His name is Eric Way. He started, he's over H&H. And the CEO, Dr. Katz, who's over H&H, is placing the administrators in hospitals. So his primary site will be Kings County, and he'll be working clinically next month. So he started a program with Eric Katz called Second Victims in LA County, and this is exactly what you're talking about. He had a little webinar when he came in to introduce himself to H&H that he's starting that same program here, so that we can train providers about how they are second victims. So you should probably get involved in that, one.
Yeah.
And two, we are starting to recognize that this is an issue, and we are starting to address it. And it's nice that we have an emergency physician coming to our departments who's specifically addressing this across the H&H campuses.
And his name is Eric Way?
Eric Way.
So Eric Way, everybody.
You guys will meet, and you'll meet him clinically because he signed up for a bunch of shifts in September. I've not met him, but he did, as I said, if you Google it, he did a talk on it, and it was fantastic.
Okay, great. Great. Thank you. Yes.
That is amazing. I think that your lecture was amazing because in this culture of like emergency medicine, I figured out that no one wants to talk about this. Someday you have like a really bad shift and you just want to go home and cry. And no one say that. Like, no one talk about this stuff, or you're super overwhelmed, you're super tired. The only thing that you want to do is cry. And you feel so overwhelmed that you can't talk about that stuff.
Totally.
And I think that was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I also think just about that sometimes I think we're misled to think that if we go have a few beers with one of our colleagues, it's going to take care of it. And that's like the blind leading the blind, right? That's like suffering, right? Not that that's not important for camaraderie and like that, like combats isolation, connectedness, but it doesn't get at this, what I'm talking about here. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
That was really excellent. I just want to say, though, that the program directors are really here in this program very supportive, much more supportive than most programs. So you do have someone to go to.
Definitely.
I've been very impressed how the people sitting behind me are very good at doing this and care about this.
Definitely. They are also victims, though. I just want to point that out. Yes. They have also sometimes larger wounds than we do just starting out, right? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this before. I think that one of the most important things about this kind of stuff is to identify that it's going to happen to you. And I think Beth made a good point. Made that point. It's not a factor of if it's going to happen to you. This happens. We all go through burnout. We all are victims. The important thing is to recognize it in yourself, see when it's affecting you, and if it's becoming a problem, you need to get help. And again, not from the other people going through the same thing as you most of the time, but looking outside.
It has nothing to do with like seniority. Like, it's really cyclical.
Yeah.
You know, it's time of year, your other personal things that are going on. That's, cyclical and how it's going to impact you.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.